Hello everyone. Today I've prepared a very special story to share with you all. This isn't something I experienced myself. It's a story I received from someone else. It's the kind of tale that's both fascinating and heavy, the kind that tugs at your heart. I really wanted to share it with you, so here we are. Sit back, get comfortable, and let's step into the life of a man I'll call Chang-sik together, shall we? In my job, I meet a lot of people. I run a project office where we gather experts from different fields, hold meetings, put our heads together to reach conclusions, and then get to work. It was last August when a new project came up, and we started recruiting specialists. As the applications piled up, one person stood out. I'll call him Chang-sik here. The day I first met Chang-sik is still vivid in my mind. The air in the room, the sound of the door creaking open, all of it. The meeting room door slid open quietly, and there he was, Chang-sik. He was about 175 centimeters tall, but so thin that his clothes hung loosely on him. He couldn't have weighed more than 110 pounds. His face was strikingly pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes had this vacant look, like he was staring into nothing. It was a first impression that hit me hard. As the meeting kicked off and everyone started tossing around questions and ideas, Chang-sik just sat quietly in the corner, scribbling something in his notebook. Not a single word from him. The second the meeting ended, he grabbed his bag and slipped out the door, gone like a shadow. Our meetings often bring in folks from rural areas, so we usually gather in a big city. After the meeting wraps up, most people stick around for dinner, clinking glasses and chatting away. They'll crash at a hotel for the night and head back home the next day. It's pretty routine. But Chang-sik, he was different. The moment the meeting ended, it was like a switch flipped. He'd leave right away. I'm based in Gyeongsang province and Chang-sik lives in Chungcheong province, a drive that takes over 3 hours. One time, the meeting ran late into the evening. I noticed Chang-sik looking worn out, so I approached him gently and said, "You must be tired today. Why don't you rest here before heading back?" He just gave a slight nod and then walked out anyway. The sound of the door closing behind him echoed louder than usual. He barely spoke to anyone, ever. When he sat in the meeting room, it felt like the chatter and laughter around him were echoes from a distant world, like he existed somewhere else entirely. But he listened to everything, jotting down notes so meticulously that I knew his hearing was fine. I wondered if maybe he couldn't speak, but I didn't dare ask. It felt too personal, too intrusive. Luckily, our work didn't require him to talk. As long as he documented things and we could move forward, it wasn't an issue. Still, I couldn't shake it. Why was he so silent? What story was hiding behind those empty eyes? Whenever I saw Chang-sik, I'd greet him, and he'd respond with a slight bow, but he never met my gaze. His eyes would dart away, like a wary little bird avoiding a stranger. I wanted him to feel at ease with the team, even just a little, so I made a point to approach him at every meeting. "Hey, how's your day going?" I'd say with a big smile. Or, "Does being around a crowd bother you? How about just the two of us grab a bite?" But he'd just give that faint smile, lips barely curving, and slip away quietly again. Something about that drew me in even more. I got stubborn about it. I'm going to share a meal with this guy, I told myself. Chang-sik was indispensable to our project. His notes, his organization, nobody could match how thorough he was. He was a key part of the team, and that made me want to connect with him personally even more. I kept asking over and over, but every time, it fell flat. Then came the 5th meeting. As usual, after it wrapped up, I tossed out a casual, "Chang-sik, want to grab some food before you go?" I was half expecting him to brush it off again, but this time, he gave a small nod. My heart skipped a beat. Finally, I thought, this is it. After the meeting, Chang-sik and I headed to a little diner nearby. It was one of those old places with a creaky wooden sign swaying in the breeze. We settled into a quiet corner, and as the food came out, I started chatting to break the ice. "How'd you like the meeting today? What do you do when you get home?" Simple stuff, just to lighten the mood. But Chang-sik ate in silence, listening to me ramble. The only sounds were the clink of his spoon against the bowl. Every now and then, he'd nod or flicker his eyes in response. But that was it. No words. When we finished, he looked up, said a soft "thank you," and stood to leave. I watched him walk out, the door swinging shut behind him. He didn't touch alcohol either. Most folks, around 9 p.m. after work, will say, "Hey, how about a beer?" to unwind. Not Chang-sik. He'd sip a glass of water, pick up his bag, and head out. Something about his silhouette fading into the night felt lonely, almost haunting. From August to October last year, we ate together 5 times. It was always the same. I'd talk, he'd listen, and that was that. Then, on our 5th meal, something changed. We were sitting in that same diner, the hum of the old fan overhead filling the quiet. I was mid-bite when Chang-sik looked at me and spoke, unprompted. "You have a way of making people feel at ease," he said. I froze. It was the first time I'd heard his voice. Low, quiet, like a whisper carried on the wind. It sank right into me. What would he say next? I leaned in, ears perked. Before I could ask anything, he kept going. "Why don't you ever ask why I don't talk? Why I avoid people?" I stumbled over my words, caught off guard, and mumbled, "Well, I figured there's a reason." He stared at me for a moment, his eyes searching mine, then said, "Would you listen if I told you why I live like this?" Time seemed to stop. Under the dim lights of the diner, Chang-sik's gaze flickered with something raw. It was the first time he'd opened up, and the weight in his voice pulled me in completely. He told me his story over 6 separate meetings, bit by bit. I'm going to share it with you now, pieced together as best I can. There were moments I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but the look in his eyes, steady, unshakable, convinced me it was real. This wasn't just a story. It was his life, raw and unfiltered. Chang-sik's story takes us back 40 years, to when he was just a kid in elementary school. Back then, weekends meant running wild with the neighborhood boys, tearing through the mountains and fields. This was an era before video games or fancy entertainment. Kids made their own fun outdoors, covered in dirt and sweat. The favorite game for the boys was playing war up in the hills. One early summer day, when the sun burned their skin, Chang-sik joined his older friends and climbed the mountain. They'd chuck pine cones like grenades and wave sticks like rifles, shouting "bang, bang" as they dashed around. The breeze brushed their faces and the smell of grass filled the air. Mid-game, Chang-sik started looking for a spot to hide. As he scanned the woods, a small wooden shack caught his eye. In those days, some people lived by their parents' graves for years to honor them, an old tradition from way back. So seeing a shack like that in the mountains wasn't strange. Chang-sik peeked around. No voices, no footsteps, and figured it was empty, left behind after someone finished their time there. The shouts of his friends, "Over here, quick," faded into silence, and he decided to step out. But as he moved, his foot snagged on something. Startled, he looked down. A wooden box lay open, a pile of white powder spilling over some paper inside. Curious, little Chang-sik touched it with his fingers, muttering, "What's this?" "No big deal," before tossing the paper back over it and heading down the mountain. Years later, as an adult, it hit him. That was cremated bone ash. That night, back home, Chang-sik felt strange. Even though it was summer, chills shook his body, and his forehead burned with fever. It got so bad he couldn't go to school for days. When he finally dragged himself back, still weak, he couldn't join the others for gym class. The teacher said, "Stay in the classroom and watch the kids' bags." So Chang-sik slumped over his desk, dozing off. The faint sound of laughter drifted in through the window. When gym ended and the kids poured back in, one of them suddenly shouted, "My wallet's gone!" The room buzzed with confusion, and all eyes turned to Chang-sik. He'd been the only one there. Panicked, he froze, but his friends stuck up for him. Chang-sik wouldn't do that, they said. He was known as a good kid, and besides, his family was well off. Stealing made no sense, but the teacher wasn't convinced. He hauled Chang-sik to the staff room, barking, "Tell the truth." Chang-sik sobbed, "I didn't take it." But it didn't matter. The slaps kept coming until his body was bruised and his face stung. He stumbled back to class, tears streaming, drowning in unfairness. After school, he skipped the main road home and took a narrow alley instead, a shortcut to crawl into bed faster. The alley smelled damp, and the wind howled softly through it. That's when he saw A kid from his class, outside a corner store. A was holding an expensive toy and a bag of snacks, stuff he couldn't afford, coming from a poor family. Suspicious, Chang-sik tailed him quietly. At the edge of the alley, A glanced around nervously, then slipped the missing wallet, B's wallet from class, into his pocket and ducked into his house. Rage boiled up inside Chang-sik. He stormed over and grabbed A's arm. "Tell the truth, or I'm telling the teacher. I got beaten because of you. How could you do this?" A smirked, cold as ice, and said, "Go ahead and try." Chang-sik's anger exploded. His vision went white. His heart pounded like a drum. Then he saw it. Black smoke curled up from A's head, slow and eerie, and behind his shoulder, bloodshot eyes glared at Chang-sik, unblinking. Fear gripped him, his legs trembling. A turned and walked into his house, that bloodshot-eyed woman clinging to his back like a shadow, vanishing with him. Chang-sik stumbled home, muttering, "Am I losing it? Was that real?" He buried himself under the blankets, his mind a mess. The next day at school, A wasn't there. The teacher came in, voice low. "I got hit by a car this morning. He's in a coma. Won't be back for a while." Chang-sik felt a pang of pity, but that didn't last. The teacher dragged him to the staff room again, accusing him with fists. "It was you, wasn't it?" Chang-sik wanted to scream, "I took it," but he couldn't rat out a kid in the hospital. So he took the beating again, limping back to class, fury and helplessness choking him. Later, as the teacher walked off toward the bathroom, Chang-sik glimpsed it again, black smoke trailing behind, those bloodshot eyes staring from over the teacher's shoulder. For an elementary school kid, it was pure terror. His chest tightened, breath stuck in his throat. The next morning, the teacher didn't show up for roll call. Another teacher stepped in and said, "Your teacher's sick and can't come in." But during recess, whispers spread among the kids. The teacher had died the night before, fell off a bridge after drinks with colleagues. Chang-sik's heart sank. Is this my fault? Did my anger do this? Guilt crashed over him like a wave. He ran home and spilled everything to his mom. "Mom, I think weird things are happening because of me." She hugged him tight, her voice soft. "It's just a coincidence, honey. Don't worry too much." Her warm embrace was his only refuge. That night he barely slept, but in the early hours, voices woke him. His mom was outside, smoking with a woman she worked with at the bar, talking in hushed tones. Chang-sik listened closely. Chang-sik was born with a tough fate, his mom said, her voice breaking. They said he was destined to be a shaman, not a regular one, but one who brings death. Some evil spirit wanted him as its vessel. She choked back tears. When he was barely 100 days old, we took him to a temple, gave him a Buddhist name, and held a ritual to protect him. But that spirit must have lured him to that shack in the mountains. Chang-sik's blood ran cold. He couldn't breathe. His mom called in a shaman to perform a ritual, an old ceremony with dancing and chanting to chase away spirits or change fate. The suppression ritual helped a bit, but the healing ones? Every time they tried, the shamans collapsed and it fell apart. Still, he made it through middle and high school without anything major happening, growing up to 20 just fine. At 20, Chang-sik started dreaming of being an artist. During a holiday, relatives gathered, and his second uncle, drunk and loud, mocked him. "You, an artist? Learn a trade and make a living instead." The sneering tone made Chang-sik's blood boil. That laugh echoed in his head. That night, as he slept, he saw his uncle driving off in the morning. Black smoke rising, those bloodshot eyes watching. Fear gnawed at him. Days later, word came. His uncle died in an explosion at work. Chang-sik realized something awful. When he hated someone, they got hurt. He decided to lock his anger away, to keep his mouth shut. He thought he could control it. Then his first uncle got into a fight with his dad and slapped Chang-sik. "Who do you think you are, kid?" The sting of that hit unleashed his rage again, and he saw those eyes over his uncle's shoulder. Days later, that uncle died in a drunken brawl, a head injury ending him. Chang-sik told his mom everything, but his stepdad, his real dad's replacement, turned cold. "You killed my brothers," he'd yell, pushing Chang-sik away. At 30, his stepdad, drunk and furious, hurled insults at him. Chang-sik tried to hold it in, but the anger broke free. That year, his stepdad died of a heart attack and stroke. That night, Chang-sik wept in front of the mirror, hating the person staring back. He became a figure of fear to everyone around him. Unable to take it, he left home and lived alone. One day, he found an old bar where the owner and a waitress welcomed him. Sharing a beer and small talk there became his only comfort. He started dating the waitress, and for 5 months, life felt calm. Then one day, he saw it. Black smoke and those eyes over both their heads. He ignored the dread, but that night, the bar burned down, and they were gone. Chang-sik knew then, this wasn't chance. His heart shattered. He went back to his mom's house, but his aunt screamed, "You're a curse." He saw those eyes on her too, and soon she died of sudden liver failure. His mom, desperate, said, "I'll take the spirit instead," and opened a place where people came to ask about their fates. A shaman's den with rituals and fortune readings. But 2 months later, she was gone. Lung cancer took her fast. Chang-sik believed she'd taken the spirit with her. Her last smile haunted him. He wandered the country after that, avoiding people. A fight with his brother-in-law ended with the man dead of a heart attack, and Chang-sik locked himself away. He took jobs he could do without meeting anyone, surviving into his late 40s. But the curse, anger leading to death, never left. He tried to end it all, but something always stopped him. A rope snapping, a stranger barging in. At a clinic, they called it panic and delusions, gave him pills, declared unfit to work. He lived off meager aid, but it wasn't enough. He had to keep working. He slept through the day, wandered at night or in the rain, dodging everyone. Phone calls? Too risky. He stuck to short texts. Yes, no. He visited shamans, but they'd back away, saying, "I can't read your fate." A prediction based on birth date and time they couldn't see. Over 6 meetings he told me this, ending with, "It stops when I die." My heart ached. "Call me if you need to talk, I'll just listen," I said. He looked at me, eyes soft, and said, "You're the kindest person I've met." But since February this year, he's been silent. No work traces, no calls answered, no texts read. Maybe he's cut off the world, maybe he's avoiding me, or maybe he's gone for good. I hope Chang-sik's free from this fate. His story felt like a cry for help, and I felt him open up to me. If he's out there watching, just one call, please. You all, we can't fully grasp his life, but feeling angry isn't wrong, right? That's it for today. Thanks for listening.